All right, I believe we are opening up the meeting now. We're going to start letting our guests in, and as people join, we will continue to let them in. Thank you, David, for running the show for us. And welcome to everyone who is here and anyone tuning in later to this recording. Welcome, and thank you for tuning in to listen to this wonderful conversation that is really important and relevant to our community and neighbors today. This is our Lunch and Learn, our Taboo Topics Lunch and Learn webinar series. Today's topic is spiritual abuse, a topic that is becoming more and more aware, like as a society, we're becoming more and more aware of it. It's being used more, defined more, and examined more as a system of abuse. For mental health, spiritual health, and emotional health, it is becoming more and more of a concern in the ways in which religious institutions and bodies enact spiritual abuse and the ways in which they don't. It being the month of Pride, we want to celebrate the rainbow that is our humanity and be open to everyone's perspectives. And we feel that this conversation is really important to educate ourselves on, to be allies, or to become aware ourselves of any kind of spiritual abuse or religious trauma that we may have experienced, our friends and neighbors may have experienced, and so on and so forth. It's an opportunity to become more educated and more aware of this issue. I want to briefly introduce myself to those of you who do not know me. I am the Reverend Erin Hougland Glass. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Interfaith Cooperation. At the center, we really like to foster conversation across difference. We believe it's possible to create that third space, which is a principle in interfaith dialogue, that is a neutral ground for all views and opinions to come forward to the table, and that we can respect each other and our humanity through our differences and learn from one another while we examine each other's value systems and perspectives and lenses. It also gives us an opportunity to reflect more deeply on our own. We celebrate religious pluralism. We believe it enriches our society and our community to be exposed to and in conversation with people of different faith and value systems. And for us, that also includes folks who do not belong to any religious system, or maybe have left the religious institutions of their family of origin for reasons such as spiritual abuse, or maybe they do not find a spiritual connection there. So we want to engage in all of those conversations at the center. We are very open to learning from one another and to creating conversations just like this one, where we dive into something that might feel a little bit dicey, a little bit uncomfortable, but is really important and relevant to discuss. So thank you all so much for being here. I want to especially thank our guest today, who I will be interviewing and talking with on this topic, Lucas Wilson. He is, I'm going to read your beautiful bio here, Lucas. Dr. Wilson is a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto. And now, Lucas, tell me if I'm saying this correctly. I've seen it 1,000 times, but I've never been told correctly how to say. Is it Mississagua? Am I saying that right?
Mississauga.
Mississauga. Almost so close. Mississagua. So a postdoctoral fellow at University of Toronto Mississagua, and was formerly the Justice, Equity, and Transformation Postdoctoral Fellow at the University of Calgary. Lucas is the editor of the book Shame, so that's Shame, Sex, Attraction, Survivors' Stories of Conversion Therapy. And he is also the author of At Home with the Holocaust, Post-Memory, Domestic Space, and Second-Generation Holocaust Narratives. Really interesting. I ask you all to go check out his work. I also want to pop into the chat here the ways in which you can connect with Lucas and the work that he does. That narrative, or that book, received the Jordan Schneitzer First Book Publication Award. His public-facing writing has appeared in The Advocate, Queerty, LGBTQ Nation, and Religion Dispatches, among other venues. And he is currently working on 2 new anthologies, one called Don't Ask, Tell All, Stories of Christian Colleges, Anti-Queer Regimes, and Queer and Trembling Stories of LGBTQ and Religious Trauma. So very on topic, very much an expert in this area. We're very pleased and happy to have you here. And so I don't forget, before we launch into this conversation, I am going to just go ahead and highlight all of your contact information and place it here in the chat for everyone to view so that they can connect with you and your work. So that's all right here coming through to you in the chat with links that also include a discount code for folks who want to get your book, Shame, Sex, Attraction. So thank you so much for providing that information with us, Lucas. I wanted to start, before we launch into your work and studies, with a definition of spiritual abuse. This is an area that I'm very passionate about as an Episcopal priest and minister in the United States context, where things like what you've studied, conversion therapies, are being practiced in the US, in particular, I believe, coming from the Christian denomination or Christian tradition and its various denominations. And as a Christian who is a part of a tradition that is very open and accepting to the LGBTQ community, and in fact, not even open and accepting, but fully inclusive of the LGBTQ plus community, I have found a lot of individuals come to my tradition or even other traditions that are also LGBTQ affirming with a lot of religious abuse and trauma. That is now being named and defined. And one of the ways in which I like to define it, and I would love to hear your perspective on this, is using one's own value system to demean and degrade another person. And I say value system because I believe religious institutions and faith traditions are value systems. And so that's also another challenge and another conversation for some people to swallow. But in general, religious institutions, systems of faith, value systems, demeaning another individual based on their system of faith. What do you think about that, Lucas? Or what is your perspective or definition, of spiritual abuse and religious trauma?
Yeah, so I think, I'm going to perhaps just say what you said in different words because
Sure.
I think you defined it very well. I think it's when anyone or any institution, group, community, whether it be religious or faith-based or spiritual, weaponizes, this value system, this faith,
Mhm.
this religion, this spirituality, and uses that against, any individual or group that is typically vulnerable, right? Not always, but typically these are vulnerable populations that are being abused, right? And there is very much this power differential between those who, are meting out this sort of abuse, and then those who are on the receiving end, those who are wounded. And, I think this is, religious, other ways of putting it, religious manipulation,
Yes.
religious control, religious harm, religious coercion that causes an individual or groups to be wounded. And I think there are, when we think of trauma, trauma is just the Greek for wound, right? And so we're talking about a
Right.
psychological trauma, typically, not always. And when we think about those who are traumatized, those who are wounded, there are a litany of consequences for these various practices that fall under the
Mhm.
umbrella of spiritual or religious abuse. We can think of folks, the negative impact on folks' ability to construct existential meaning. I think that we can understand as a spiritual consequence of this abuse. We can think about a negative impact on folks' ability to connect with what they refer to as God or the divine or a higher power. There's, of course, a negative impact on one's spiritual self-identity, how people show up in the world as spiritual people, as embodied spiritual people. And then, of
Mhm.
course, especially when the spiritual abuse is done at the hands of a religious leader of a community, there's typically a negative impact on folks' relationship to that spiritual community
Right.
thereafter. So I think these are some of the consequences for what we're naming, and what we're naming is, again, spiritual abuse, and then thinking about, again, the people who are on the receiving end, or those who have these wounds, this, what we would call trauma.
Exactly. Thank you so much for elaborating on that and going into more detail about that. One of the things that I found in studying, and this is sort of anecdotal studying, as people came to me for pastoral care, and then I was asked to speak on various at conferences and things like this on the topic of spiritual abuse as a leader in a LGBTQ affirming and inclusive faith tradition, was when I worked in domestic violence nonprofits, and I started to learn more about the wheel of power and control that is often used to help survivors of domestic violence evaluate the dynamic that they're in if they're not able to readily recognize that they are in an abusive relationship. And a light bulb went off for me that, wow, arguably this wheel of power and control used in domestic violence could easily be translated to, can you answer this about your faith, your system of faith? And if you can say yes to any of these things in the wheel of power and control, then you might be in an abusive relationship with your system of faith. And I'm going to actually include that wheel here for people to look at. It is from it's called the Power and Control Wheel, and it is, again, a tool that helps individuals discern the kind of relationship that they're in, help them identify abuse, since abuse is not always talked about as readily or as openly in romantic partnerships. I feel it's similar in religious institutions because faith is so deeply personal, in the same way that intimate relationships are so deeply personal. Awareness around what abuse and abusive power and control looks like is not as explicitly discussed until something really severe happens, like abuse of children in a religious system, or something along those lines, right? And so I'm hoping to create more awareness around that, both with this conversation, but also with that power and control wheel. So that's to give you all a little bit of a framework if this is a new topic for you. I really want to talk to Lucas about his book. He studied conversion therapy practices and talked with individuals. I think his stories and his learnings are going to be really powerful for us to paint that picture. And so, Lucas, my first question for you is, can you tell us a little bit about your book? And like a brief summary of it, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so Shame, Sex, Attraction is a collection of 17 stories about conversion therapy, written by conversion therapy survivors themselves. When I was putting the collection together, I didn't want any fictional accounts of conversion therapy. I didn't think that they were as necessary or politically salient as narratives told by survivors in their own words. So I put out a call for submissions a few years ago once I got the contract, and I received the submissions that I got, most of which are in the collection, though not all. I wasn't able to include all of them. The stories are coming from a wide range of contexts. So there is a story from an Orthodox Jewish background or context. There's a story from what the author describes in his words as a Chinese cult. There is also a story written in a secular family context where one's mom, the author's mom, is their conversion therapist. But the rest of the stories, so it's the 14 other stories in the collection, are coming from high control Christian contexts. So evangelical, white Christian fundamentalist, and Pentecostal spaces. And this tracks with the research, really, that the vast majority of conversion practices are happening in high control religious contexts writ large, but specifically are happening in high control Christian context. And so the collection has, again, a range of stories. Some are, quite funny and use sort of this gallows humor to talk about their experience, mine included. Others are deathly, soberingly serious. And again, makes total sense given the subject matter. And these stories are from 3 different countries, from Canada, the US, and Australia. And there's also a foreword by Garrett Conley, the author of Boy Erased, upon which the film was based. And so, yeah, the stories, this collection is very near and dear to my heart. It's my first public-facing, creative book. The rest of the other books that I had published before and after have been academic. But my next books are not. Those ones will be public-facing as well. But yeah, I'm super excited that the book's out in the world and that it's in people's hands and they're able to read it and, again, have some small window into what it's like to go through conversion therapy. And again, the collection offers this range of practices that are employed to change individuals from queer to heteronormative and or straight.
Right, right. Thank you so much for sharing that. So I'm wondering, who do you hope picks this book up? Like, what's the ideal audience for your book?
Yeah, it's always funny, right? Who you hope to read the book and who you think actually will read the book. I mean, if I could have my choice, it would be conversion therapists. It would be people who support conversion practices as, my main readers. Do I think that these folks will ever read this book or even hear about this book? Heck no, right? I don't think that these are people, this book's on their radar. And even if it were, because of my subject, position and how I identify, I don't think that would be well received. And so I don't think that this is really within the realm of possibilities. However, the people who have picked up the book have been typically part of one or more of the three groups I'm about to name. These have been academics. People, I think because I come from the academy, people have this expectation that it is going to be academic, but the collection's not. Like, for those who read it, you'll see that it's even the difference between the introduction, which is not academic, it's academically informed, but it's very much, easily digestible to anyone and everyone who wants to read it. And then the stories themselves, the stories are very, literary. They're not academic treatments of the topic. They're not sort of analytic discussions of the topic. They are representing what it was like to be in that room or in that, basement or in that, college, office, wherever it was. And so, but nonetheless, academics have been certainly some of the main readers. Also, just folks who come from high control religious contexts, writ large, queer or straight, cis and gender diverse. People who come from, again, these high control religious spaces, particularly high control Christian spaces, those who oftentimes identify as ex-fundies or ex-evangelical. This has been a pretty significant population who's read my book. And then on top of that, a lot of queer folks. It's great because I think that for a lot of queer folks who don't come from high control religious backgrounds, and I come from an evangelical background. I think for those who are queer but don't have this experience, I think oftentimes they think that we're aliens. Like, they're like, what world do you come from? Like, how could you have ever gotten yourself in this situation? Which I hope that the book in part explains. But of course, for those who don't come from this background or these contexts, it does seem really crazy that people ever get caught up in these systems. And I am one who doesn't actually. I wasn't born into the church. Like, I chose the church for myself when I was in high school, which is a totally separate question, and I can absolutely talk more about that after. But I think for a lot of people, they're just sort of fascinated by it. But in addition to the fascination, I hope that they stay not just for the stories and, again, sort of like trying to figure out how the heck do people get involved in conversion therapy. I think what the book also shows is that although not every single queer person went through conversion therapy, and thank goodness not every queer person went through conversion therapy, every single queer person has undergone conversion practices, which is to say that every single queer person throughout their lives have been subjected to certain practices or messaging that over time accumulate, that try to change people from who they are into who they're not, right? It's these efforts, both implicit and explicit, programmatic and sort of just, out in the world, that really try to align people with the heteronormative model. That there is this sort of ontological attack that queer folks face on, in a lot of cases, a daily basis, particularly when they're young, right? Where a mom says, don't sit like that, you look like a sissy, or a dad says, you can't play with that toy, that's a toy only boys play with, right? These messages that we get from our parents, our guardians, our religious leaders, our siblings, our friends, whomever, these are messages that, again, are are conversion practices in that broad sense that really are trying to, again, make us into someone we're not. And I think that when reading this book, I think in part what we can see is that, again, although not every queer person went through conversion therapy, every single queer person has been subjected to conversion practices.
Right. Right. And so that's also making me think too about how spiritual abuse is not just a topic defined by the abuse that's been enacted on queer persons or people within the LGBTQ community, but any person that doesn't fit the norm, right? Like the patriarchy is also an aspect of that abuse system where there are some traditions where women don't have a place or have a voice, right? And or children or different racial contexts, like that any system of oppression that is enacted by a spiritual or religious institution is a form of abuse of power, right? And so it's just making me think about that, right? Like that these conversion practices are conform to the norm, right? And in this context of the LGBTQ plus community, conform to heteronormative practices, but as a woman, conform to being a girl and what girl looks like, conform to being a boy and what boy looks like, and yeah, that type of thing. Very interesting.
Well, even that, I mean, this idea, that it's not just for sexual minorities, but also gender minorities, or just, and again, women, I think, can fall under this umbrella, where we think about how centrally gender factors in conversion practices and how much of a big deal it is for conversion therapists and high control Christians writ large, right? That gender is integral to how God is understood, how leadership within the church is understood, how folks in general are understood within these spaces. And I think that, to think about how conversion practices don't just affect gender or sexual minorities, I can think of, if there's a young boy in youth group and he's wearing, nail polish because he wants to wear nail polish because nail polish is cute, right? If that's what he wants to do, and a leader says you shouldn't be wearing that, that's what gays do, or that's whatever, that's not what men do, that's a conversion practice in its own right. That might be a straight kid, but he is in some ways his gender expression, bare minimum, is more expansive than the typical stereotypical norms. And so that's an example of a straight person who's experiencing conversion therapy or conversion practices. And so again, I think that this book is, even can be applicable to those beyond. And I think all of this is feeding into, and what you were saying is this idea of conversion or this idea of coercion or this idea of like colonization that so many of us we're pushed into a very specific, we're pushed to follow a very specific script. And if we don't follow that, then we're in trouble. And that's where we see abuse happening when we blur these lines, when we transgress these boundaries that have been very firmly established for us. And I think that this is just speaking to spiritual or religious abuse writ large, that this is really just what causes it, is that anyone who doesn't, follow the, rank and file orders of the leaders or the group in general, there is a lot of potential for spiritual abuse when folks, again, don't follow the script.
Right. Right, exactly. Thank you. So well said. So what inspired you or led you to write this book? So you'd written about the Holocaust and genocidal practices, right? Like what was the pivot and what made you want to write this book specifically?
Yeah. So most of my academic career was in Holocaust studies, like you said. I looked mostly at the antecedents of the Holocaust, so looking actually how Christian theology laid the seedbed for the Holocaust, and then looking at the aftermath of the Holocaust, so looking at the intergenerational transmission of trauma between survivors, their kids, and their grandkids. And that's what the book At Home with the Holocaust is all about. It's about the children of Holocaust survivors and what it was like to grow up in the homes of survivors. And then also the grandchildren is the last chapter. But so this was the main focus that I had, but within the academy. But I started to realize there wasn't too much of a future for me in Holocaust studies, simply because I was the token literature guy. Like Holocaust studies loves they love historians. They don't necessarily love the literature folks. And there's just, again, not much sort of preference for people who are approaching the topic by way of literature. And so I thought to myself, well, I need to pivot. Like I need to, if I want to continue in the academy, and I absolutely did at the time, still do. We'll see what happens in the next few years. But I thought to myself, I need to shift my focus, and I realized that I could apply a lot of what I had been learning in literature, in history, in religious studies. And I had a lot of really strong theoretical training. And so I was like, I could use a lot of these theories, whether it be trauma studies or affect theory or, memory studies. And I could apply this to white Christian nationalism, something that I unfortunately know quite well. I wouldn't say experientially, because as a Canadian and who was in the US for a lot of my formative religious years, I didn't track with the US sort of like the American exceptionalism narrative. Like that was just kind of anathema to me. I was like, well, I'm Canadian. Like I don't see how I fit into this picture. And so for me, I was able, and thank goodness, to separate my understanding of spirituality from my politics, in a sense of like, governmental politics. And I would not to say that there aren't white Christian nationalists in Canada. There absolutely are. I don't want to make it seem like Canada's, immune to this, because we're certainly not. But for me, I had that enough critical distance. And so when I was deciding what I wanted to focus on, I was like, okay, if I'm focusing on white Christian nationalism, what do I want to concentrate my research on? I decided that, again, given my background, given what I knew, I was going to focus on homophobia and transphobia and anti-LGBTQ, theology, sentiments, practices. And because of my experience in conversion therapy, this is actually what led to the book. I started writing more public-facing op-eds in different queer magazines. And one opportunity led to another, which led to a podcast, as these things do. Podcasts these days, everyone has a podcast,
Yes.
and then to radio programs and this kind of stuff. And so it was, it wasn't really planned. It wasn't really intentional. But then after I had written these articles and I had been doing these different speaking engagements, I got a message. I was one day at the doctor's getting just like a regular routine checkup. And I got this message on Twitter, or the artist formerly known as Twitter X. And I get this message, and it said something along the lines like, we've been reading, your work, and we think you might be the person to put this collection together about conversion therapy. Would you be interested in putting together a collection? And I thought at first, like, scam, like there's no way this is real, that someone's reaching out to me on social media. Little did I realize at the time that this is actually how a lot of these things happen, but I didn't know at the time. And so I looked up the editor, I looked up the press, and sure enough, it was real. And so it was funny that when I went into writing this collection, I had a very particular idea of what conversion therapy was, largely based on my own experience, right? Like I didn't really have a lot of hadn't done a lot of research about conversion therapy writ large. I had, again, really just approached it by way of my own biography. And so doing that book really was this deep dive into understanding conversion practices in a much more robust way. Because up until that point, again, I might have had a decent training in, religious studies writ large, but it wasn't specific to this topic. So this was a really big learning curve for me, which was phenomenal. And I got to understand, again, that not everyone's experience looks the same. In fact, oftentimes they look quite different. And looking at the different national context, looking at the historical context, looking at, the differences in practices and consequences and beyond. And so that was really how I got into the work that I'm doing today, was by way of this creative literary collection, which I'm so grateful for. It's my baby. And I just love the book. And so, yeah, that's how it came about. And again, super excited that it's out in the world today.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. And what an accomplishment. Well, if you feel comfortable, and you're completely welcome to say, I don't feel comfortable, but could you share a little bit about your story and your experience of conversion therapy?
As a former evangelical, we don't really have, what's the word? Stories that are off limits. We tell everything. So I'll share my story. Absolutely. And you know what? The story that's included in Same-Sex Attraction, that is different from the story that I'm sharing in the next book. What I will say is the story in Same-Sex Attraction is about my experience in group conversion therapy at Liberty.
Okay.
It's titled Gay Christian Speed Dating, which is pretty much how these groups operate, as sort of this underground, like, in-person grinder. But that's its own thing. And so what I talk about in the next book, and I'll give you, again, some intel here. That's my one-on-one experience, and that I went through the one-on-one program at Liberty University is where I did my undergrad. I'll talk more about that in a second. And that's all 4 years that I was doing my undergrad. I was in this program. So I was not raised in a Christian home. I came from, my mom was, I always say, haunted by her Baptist demons with which she grew up. And my dad was sort of this agnostic, hippity-dippity, wrote a book on Bob Dylan at a music studio and a record store downtown. He was just this cool, cultured guy. And it made for a funny little household for me and my siblings. And I'm the youngest of 5. And so we grew up in Toronto. And I wasn't, again, we went to church when I was young up until about, grade 2 or 3 for me. And again, I'm the youngest. And then like any good Canadian family, we stopped going to church and just went to the cottage instead. And so that was sort of my religious background. I eventually chose to go to Liberty in large part because I knew that they had a program for guys like me. And the program, once I got there, to just fast forward, was, and to answer your question, the program was, it was in the first few meetings when I met with my conversion therapist. And I should say that when I was there, I didn't conceptualize my experience as conversion therapy. And that's quite common for a lot of survivors. A lot of survivors don't think of their time in conversion therapy as conversion therapy. They instead think of it, say, as pastoral counseling. And that's how I understood my experience. It wasn't until grad school that someone said, "Oh, you went through conversion therapy." And I was like, "What?" And then I did a quick, and I had, of course, heard of conversion therapy, but it wasn't until having that language given to me to map onto my experience that I acknowledged that, in fact, I had. And so when I met with this pastor, again, it was understood as spiritual counseling, pastoral counseling. And I met with him over the span of the 4 years that I was there on a weekly basis. And in the first few meetings, it was very much like a pseudo-Freudian approach to human sexuality. So it was understanding what was my relationship like with my mom and to my dad and even to my siblings. And the theory goes within a lot of these spaces that there has to be a defective or broken relationship that one has with one's parent or parents or siblings that causes them to be queer. Very much this developmental narrative that, again, that there was some sort of like early childhood trauma, specifically sexual trauma, or again, this defective relationship with parent or parents that would cause one's queerness. Well, I didn't have anything in my background that was,
I was just about to ask, what if you don't have an answer to that? Yeah, fascinating.
Well, the rhetorical and mental gymnastics of conversion therapists, they're Herculean. They can do a lot. And so they really stretch this narrative. And I guess the closest to the narrative that would fit or work according to the theories that undergird conversion practices, the closest theory was that I had an overbearing mother. And I mean, to their point, I did have an overbearing mother. Like Cheryl was wild. However, looking back, and was she any more overbearing than really anyone else's mother? Like, I don't think so. I don't know. And I had like a really strong relationship with my dad. He was arguably much more involved in my life than my mom. Came to all my soccer games, my chess games, my dance recitals. The writing was on the wall, Erin. Like I knew that I was a young homosexual. And I'm pretty sure Keith did too. Anywho, so that we had to find a narrative. We had to find a theory for how, what was the problem? What was the root cause for my queerness? So these first few sessions were very much get to know you and, get to know you very deeply immediately, which, very much falls in line with a lot of the sort of like get to know people in general in these communities. But it was very much like, tell me all of your secrets. Tell me all of your, tell me your masturbation habits, your porn habits, like very uncomfortable, bizarre, weird questions. Looking back at the time, I didn't know because he was a spiritual leader on campus. And so I thought, well, I have to answer these questions honestly.
And that's where that position of power being utilized to ask such sensitive questions with the aim of changing you and your essential self is really such an abuse, an abuse of power. Sorry, I just need to chime in there. Yeah.
And with no training, right? This man did not have even a graduate degree. He had a degree from Washington Bible College, which I don't even know if it was accredited. And so these were the first get to know you sessions, very much taking an inventory of who I was and my relationships from a young age. from there, once we had established that it was my mom's fault, which was very like, the book of Genesis, like her fault, she did it, Eve.
Women again.
Yeah,
Just
come
women.
on.
It's always the women.
So with that, we started on a weekly basis. We very much had a routine. So I'd come in, he would always give me a very big bear hug, which looking back, is very weird, and I understand why he was doing it now. But at the time, I always sort of chalked it up to him, showing me like good touch, bad touch, very much this like infantilizing exercise, like this is how men can interact with one another, sort of deal. And that's also how we ended our meetings too. He'd always give me another big bear hug. And so I'd sit down and we would read scripture together. We would read this book together. My manual was Journey into Growth into Manhood, Resuming the Journey by Alan Medinger, which was this ex-gay, textbook essentially written by one of the former leaders of Exodus International. And we read this, and I had my copy up until when I moved from Florida to Toronto, back to Toronto. And so I lost it, but I wish I still had it. But it had all my underlinings and markings, and it was crazy to see what I thought, was important at the time. And so we would then, he would pray for me. I never prayed for myself, which I think is quite telling, that he was the one to intercede on my behalf. And of course, we're coming from a Protestant tradition, which is like anyone can just directly, talk to God, but it was always him praying for me, him speaking on my behalf. And also when he prayed, and this was something that again, going back to that tactile aspect, that physical, bizarre, and at this point, very creepy dynamic, was that he would always put his hand either on my shoulder or on my leg. And the way that one of my friends once described it, he said it was never low enough that you didn't notice, but it was never high enough that you could say something, but it was enough that you noticed, like you clocked it, And so there was that as well. And again, I'm very confident in why I think he was doing that. And he did that to a lot of students. And so I think that this was, again, very much the routine. This was, we would, and then we would pray again. And I think that part of what he also pushed me to do, and also the textbook, echoed this, was that I needed to do the things that men do, talk like a man, talk about the things that men talk about, and, talk to men. Very much this like homosocial emphasis on men, masculinity, and trying to mirror or mimic that masculinity as a way of faking it till you make it. So if I were to align my gender performance, that in turn my gender identity would change, where I would feel more like a man. And of course, this is an essentialist understanding of masculinity and manhood, so that once you change your performance and you are a real man, you are then therefore a straight man. And again, just to underscore how prominently gender figures within this, conversion ideology. And so for me, I think about this, that all of this at the time, very much, to be honest, it felt like I was doing the right thing. It felt like I was going in the right direction. And I had deluded myself, and I was being deluded by my conversion therapist that there was change, with like absolutely no evidence to back that up. But again, being convinced that there was change. For me, I think about my personal experience and the violence of my personal experience as coming after my time in conversion therapy. It was not so much in the moment. Because again, I was being, cheered on, and, I had a pat on the back and was saying, you're doing it.
Sure. And you were being groomed, really.
1,000.
Yeah.
And it was after the fact when I got to grad school, and I was like, nothing's changing. Nothing has changed. And this was the moment. I still remember I was washing the dishes after dinner. I was about to go to the pub to visit a buddy for a beer. And I was just finishing up, and it was very moody at the time, and it was, the light was above the sink, and it was, no other lights in the apartment were on. And this was the split level apartment I was living in. So this was in the basement. And I remember I was praying. I was talking to God, and I said, God, and this was one of the first times I ever swore when I was talking to God, which felt very liberating, to be honest. But it was this moment of I was, I was really standing up for myself, I think, for the first time. And this was also at the time that I was reading Jewish authors who were really wrestling with God. And within Jewish traditions, it's much more common to have that sort of grappling match.
I love that. Yes, I love that from our Jewish neighbors. Yeah, it's a beautiful practice of arguing with God. Abraham debating with God. Yes, love that. Love that.
That's it. And I remember I had read Elie Wiesel, who directly addresses God in this very like protest esque manner, not protest esque, it was a protest. He was protesting God's silence and inaction during the Holocaust. And so I was, I
Mhm.
think, in a lot of ways inspired by him. And he really profoundly shaped how I, came to understand myself as a spiritual person. But it was in this moment that I was praying. I was like, God, what the hell? Like, what the fuck is going on? How have I not changed? And I remember thinking, like, I have tried and I have tried and I have tried. I met with Pastor Dane. This was before I understood it as conversion therapy. I just thought I met with Pastor Dane. I've read my Bible. I have, read as many books as I possibly can about this. I remember I fasted constantly. If you count up the number of weeks
Mm,
that I just didn't eat as a spiritual practice, it would have been months, Erin. And
mm,
so I was like, God, what is going on? How, if you told me that you want me to change and you want me to change and if you're perfect and I'm not, you're not the problem. Seemingly, I'm the one who is the problem. And when you see yourself as a problem, that's a problem, right? And so that's where that guilt that I had felt, right, feeling bad about the discrete individual actions I had done turned into shame. So it's not just I felt bad about these just these discrete individual actions. It's that I felt like I was bad. I felt like I was dirty. I was defective. I was,
right.
degenerate. And so I thought to myself, like, again, if God's perfect, I'm the problem. And again, that's where I think the violence really set in for me, and having to undo
Mhm.
that, untangle that really took years. And
Yes.
therapy, like actual therapy, is of course quite helpful.
Hmm.
But also
Hmm.
for me, grad school, I think really helped me in a lot of ways as well. But this was, again, this is how I understand the violence of conversion therapy for myself, was in the
Yeah,
aftermath.
I agree. And I think in my experience of, I'm also a queer woman and pansexual, and I grew up in a home where it was very okay to be LGBTQ in the Episcopal tradition. But it wasn't okay to not choose your identity. Like there was this, again, sort of back to our earlier conversation about cultural conversion practices of like fit into a box that I understand, right? That the bisexuality or the pansexuality piece didn't make sense, so I needed to pick a team, so to speak, right? And so there was that was imposed on me, and then as I've pastored to and ministered to many individuals who have experienced what you're describing, the real violence is this deep-seated feeling of I'm broken. There is something deeply, inherently, and essentially wrong with my soul. And that is one of the most painful and violent thoughts that we can have about ourselves. And it leads to severe mental health issues and then also physical health issues outside of mental health issues alone. So yeah, thank you for naming that as violence, because I do believe it's not stated enough that the words and the ways in which we are raised to conform to certain boxes that we can't quite fit in, and then therefore turn inward and start to criticize and self loathe and hate who we are and how we are very naturally because we can't fit into what's expected of us is a kind of violence. It is just awful. It is violence against self, right, in another form, but it's these internalized voices. Um, and then something else that you've said that I really want to talk about is, and I think in the introduction of your book, you argue obviously that these conversion therapies are ineffective and harmful, but also motivated by genocidal intentions. I want to hear more about that, especially with your experience studying and writing on the Holocaust.
Yeah. So one thing I want to pick up that you just said, and then I promise it feeds
Of
into your
course.
to your question,
Yes.
is that when when we name it as violence, that's important, and language matters, right? Where we
Yes.
use appropriate, apt language to describe or evaluate our experiences. It's important that we use the correct language, and again, I do believe that violence is the right word. When we're talking about conversion therapy, there is this question that's sometimes asked, because in Canada, we have a nationwide ban against conversion practices for all ages. It's not just
Oh,
youth
wow.
or minors who are protected, it's anyone and everyone. And it's not just in clinical context, it's in every context, religious, educational, whatever. No one is allowed to practice conversion therapy, and no one is able to consent to conversion therapy. And the reason why is that, what does it mean to consent to conversion therapy? Another way of asking that question, again, this is where language matters, is what does it mean to consent to abuse, right? Conversion therapy is definitional abuse, right? We're talking about coercion, we're talking about manipulation, we're talking about control, we're talking about harm, we're talking about, the weaponization of folks' sincerely held beliefs against them, right? Their value system, their religion, their relationship to God, the divine higher power. All of this is, again, manipulated and changed into a violent force for, well, evil. And so this is abuse. So what does it mean to say, oh, I consent to abuse? Like, no one, no cop, no judge would say, oh, well, she should have the choice, or he should have the choice, or they should have the choice to consent to abuse. No one would say that, right? No one would ask, is it like, shouldn't people be able to consent to their own abuse? It's a crazy question. And it's synonymous with asking, should not people be able to consent? Adults, should they not be able to consent to conversion therapy? It's a bonkers question. According to the UN Rapporteur on Torture, in certain instances, not all, but in certain instances, conversion practices constitute torture. Should we ever be able to ask, shouldn't people be able to consent to their own torture? Like, what a silly, silly question. But again, that's the question that's being asked. And so anytime that people, again, are like, well, at the end of the day, shouldn't people be able to have the choice? It's their sincerely held religious beliefs, or in this, recent Supreme Court case, it's about, free speech, whatever. Again, we need to use the appropriate language, the apt language to ask these questions, to have these conversations, to describe conversion therapy. And again, the synonymous terms are abuse and in some cases torture. And so, speaking of appropriate or apt language, I, in the introduction, as you said, draw upon the work of two sociologists coming out of James Madison University, Sue Spivey and Christine Robinson, who employ the language of genocidal intentions when talking about that which motivates conversion practitioners. Spivey, Robinson, and I are not saying that conversion practitioners practice genocide, right? And this is something that some people have sort of leveled against me, like, you said that they said, or they said, and now you're saying that conversion practitioners practice genocide. No, I didn't. Never have I ever, never will I, because they can't. The beautiful sort of irony of conversion therapy is that conversion therapy is so ineffective that they can't practice genocide against us and change us. That's not to say that the abuse and the consequences are not real. That's a huge problem. But again, they're so ineffective in the sense that they have never, ever achieved one of their goals, right? They can change how someone expresses their gender in a very performative and, theatrical acting sort of way, but they can't change how people identify. They can't change people's desires or orientations or, who they are. So this is to say that conversion practitioners are not practicing genocide. They can't. They're so bad at their jobs. What they are saying,
and murder is like that would be noticed, right? Like that, like it also, right? Yeah. Exactly.
And there are some folks out there calling for queer's demise, like, but they're not. They're these fringe sort of like voices, coming from, I don't know, who knows where. And I think that what Robinson, Spivey, and I are arguing is that they are motivated by genocidal intentions, which is to say, their entire goal, if they could have their way, if their desires could be, actualized, queer people would not exist. They sincerely want a world that is free of queer representation, of queer culture, of queer vitality, of queer love, of queer community, of queerness. That is to say, they want queers gone. They want us to be completely erased.
Erasure. That's what I was going to say. Yes, erasure.
And this goes back to, what are they motivated by? What are they desiring? They're genocide. They have genocidal intentions that are motivating their work. Again, they're so bad at their jobs. But again, that doesn't take away from the fact that there are really real consequences for what they do and the harm, the trauma that they enact. This is, of course, again, the problem. And so although they've never, ever changed anyone, they are nonetheless motivated by their desire to see us completely gone.
Right. And a complete erasure of culture and people and ways of being is genocidal intention. Yes. Now, I've got two more questions and then I want to open it up to everyone. And my first question is, how do people heal from this type of spiritual abuse, religious trauma enacted by conversion therapy and other types of spiritual and religious abuse from your studies and experience and research that you've done?
Yeah, so there was a recent Canadian study that named the top two ways for folks to come to terms with their experiences was by way of finding a supportive community in general. It did not mean that they needed to find a queer specific community, but a community that was supportive, that listened, and made space for them to share their experiences. The second cited way was finding a queer community. So these two, I think, are quite important. The third, and then we can talk about actual therapy, like legitimate therapy by licensed practitioners who are not trying to change folks. This is, of course, quite healing. But even when in these, let's use these top three ways, right? So we have a community in general, a queer specific community, and then a therapist. With all three of these groups or these contexts or these outlets, these avenues for healing, these are places and people and spaces that allow for people to, like I said, come to terms with their experience, which is to say that they are finding terms, they are finding language to name what happened. So often what happens when we're talking about trauma in general, it doesn't have to be spiritual trauma or religious trauma, but trauma in general, is that what happens is the wounding that occurs happens at a moment that is so immense, so much, and not just moment, like a moment. Sometimes it's this long sort of like years and years and years within a high control church, or years and years and years in this really conservative, school, whatever it might be. But that the mind's ability to take in, to register, to neatly organize what happened is not either likely, but it's oftentimes quite difficult and impossible for someone to really take in all that's happening. That the moment of trauma or the moments of trauma far exceed the mind's capacity to really, again, register. And so what we oftentimes see with folks who have experienced trauma is that there's, sometimes recurring nightmares, there's repetition of certain things that we do that in some ways give voice to that trauma. There's a reenactment of the traumatic scene. And so all this to say is that really the mind is trying to come to terms. It's trying to find language. It's trying to find an expression of what happened, which is a way of really externalizing what happened and a way of, in some ways, controlling the narrative, because the narrative up until that point has controlled them. And so if we're talking about a group who is queer affirming, if we're talking about a queer specific group that's queer affirming, and or a therapist who is queer affirming, all three of these contexts, people, spaces, groups, whatever, these are ways that people are able to come to terms with their experience. They're able to find language to wrap around that which has been really, in a lot of ways, amorphous or hard to pin down, in a way that allows for them not to move beyond, right? No, none of us are going to move beyond what happened to us. Like, newsflash, that sort of, it's not the greatest
part of your
news,
story.
but it's part of your story. And we move
Yeah.
forward with that. We take that with us, but we actually have a way to contain it, which is by way of narrative, language, in a way that makes sense. And the research actually suggests that it doesn't even have to be an accurate narrative. Like, it could be filled with fictions. But if you are to move forward with a narrative, a way of understanding what happened, that's where healing happens. That's where, and again, obviously you hope that it's rooted in reality. Like that, I'm not advocating for anything else.
Always, yes.
But nonetheless, the research does suggest that as long as you have a narrative, a way of framing it, a way of containing it, you are able to move forward with that in a way that's much healthier than, say, not articulating what happened and just having to deal with the consequences that are again intangible, and you can't really figure out what's going on until you again come to terms with what happened.
Right. And I think that's true. We're now learning about all trauma can't just be boxed up and put on a shelf, that it will find its way out because the brain will demand that it be processed and the body will suffer many ailments, physical and mental and emotional, as a result without processing it. And so, yeah, I'm hearing you say like story sharing, narrative story sharing in safe spaces where you're seen and heard is healing, which is just beautiful. And so much of the work that we do at CIC is just about seeing and hearing others. And this actually leads me into my final question, and then we can open it up to the audience for any questions that they might have, which is to say that there are many traditions that deeply believe that homosexuality or women being in charge or, what have you. In this context, we're talking specifically about the LGBTQ community, um, are not right, that they're wrong, right? Like, and they don't want to hurt people at the same time, right? And so one of the things I love about CIC is that we can sit down at the table and we all believe in the dignity of one another, even if we may have different beliefs about the LGBTQ topic or different beliefs about women's role in spirituality. And, two people opposing may deeply disagree with each other on a fundamental basis, and our values may be very different. But what's the difference between that and what spiritual abuse looks like, in your opinion? How can we have our value systems without hurting other people and be in community with people, even if we don't agree with who they are or how they are in the world?
Yeah. I will say first, and this is, I'm going to preface this, but then I'm going to jump into the answer, I promise.
Mm-hmm.
It's a wild thing to have your very part of your very being, part of your core questioned. It is a wild experience to have someone say, I don't agree with you as a person on a fundamental level, when that part of you, not the totality of me, not all of me is, is queer. I mean, there are other parts to me as well. But the queer part of me, which imbues a lot, I should say that as well, not to
It
sort of
is an
compartmentalize.
it's a part of our essential selves. Yes, of
This
course. Yes, it's our
constitutive,
gender identity as well, right? Yes.
exactly. It is a wild thing for someone to say, I don't agree with you about that. It's like, it's not the same, but it's like saying, well, you're a woman. I just don't agree that that's okay. It's like
And there's
saying,
literally nothing I can do about that. I am a woman, right? Like, this is how I believe God made me to be, but
yeah,
that's fundamentally wrong, right? So I hear what you're saying. Yes, yes.
your eye color, I just don't agree with it. You'd look at the person and be like, what the heck do you mean? Like, it is a crazy thing. And I don't want to ever normalize that. I want anyone who has that opinion, I want them to feel uncomfortable, because trust, it has made the group that I'm a part of unbelievably uncomfortable for decades, if not centuries. So that's
Right.
first and foremost. However, do I take away, or will I ever deny a person who thinks it's wrong for me to be simply myself, the right to believe that? No, like, I am, I suppose, in that more traditional sense, a liberal. I mean, I think I'm a flaming progressive, but I would say that I'm, liberal in that sense. Um, I would say the difference between what you were describing, the former, which is having, people sit at the same table and have a conversation and actually engage, versus the latter of saying, like, I just don't agree and therefore, and then having sort of cut off communication or trying to change people. I think the
Right.
difference is the attempt to change someone. If that is by cutting off communication, like, I won't talk to you until you change, or I will talk to you, and every single time I talk to you, I'm going to try to change you, or I'm going to drop these subtle hints that you should change and that you need to change. That's, I
Mm-hmm.
think, the difference. That's the violence. So if
Mm-hmm.
there is someone who's homophobic, and I do want to use, the appropriate language, or anti-queer, whatever language you want to use. Some people have a problem with homophobia or homophobic, but at this point, language shifts and changes, and I think it's a perfectly fine descriptor. But if someone is anti-queer, thinks it's wrong to be gay, and they want to be my friend, sure. Like, my mother, like, case in point, we could talk about her. But it's like, if that's the case, it's like, yeah, I'm absolutely willing to sit down and talk with someone. Like, if it's not my job, whose job is it then to talk to folks who disagree?
Mm-hmm.
Again, while noting that it's a really crazy thing that we need to at least acknowledge. This is a wild thing that my very identity is on the table for discussion, but okay, let's go for it.
Right.
But I think that the difference is that if someone is in good faith, I guess, pun intended, wanting to have a conversation about this, I'm absolutely down to clown. Like, that's totally,
Mm-hmm.
a conversation that's what I'm willing to have. But if the moment that someone with me or with other people try to change me, that's not only the problem, that's the violence, right?
Right.
I don't come into any conversation ever trying to convince anyone, oh, you really need to love medium rare steak. And if you don't, like, well, there'll be problems. You know, like I love medium rare steak, but does that mean that I'm going to come in and like force that on anyone? No, I don't care what people like their steak preferences are, if they're even going to eat steak. I don't care if anyone is going to vote, you know, NDP, which is Canada's like super progressive party. Like that's what I do. But am I going to try to convince you? No, that's not my job. That's no one's job to try to change someone. Our job is to be in community, to be in relationship, and to challenge people. Sure, you can challenge people in a conversation, a debate. That's great. That's fine. But to say like I'm actively trying to change you, particularly a constitutive part of who you are, right? Like that's not friendship. That's not community. That's coercive. That's manipulative. That's arguably abusive.
Right. I couldn't agree more. And I believe that it is possible to be in community, and it's not being demonstrated well on the political stage or on the public stage these days, but we at CIC really firmly believe that it is possible to be in respectful, loving community with those that we have fundamental differences with, and that we are continuing and always learning from one another in those contexts, and that we have to be open to and also believe that every human being deserves respect no matter what, right? And that is something that kind of has to set the framework for those types of conversations that we have at CIC, but like what you're discussing, I think is really important. Well, and thank you so much. We are actually, because I had so many questions, I'm sorry to the audience, but if anyone does have a question, please pop it into the chat or feel free to unmute yourself. I know we're going a little bit over on time, and I completely apologize, but I was very much loving this conversation and asking lots of questions. Does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask? I know a couple people had to sign off and go back into their work. Thank you all so much for joining this conversation. Lucas, thank you so much for participating, for sharing yourself, for being open to having, and for reaching out. I want everyone to know that Lucas reached out to us to have this conversation at a time when I was exactly looking for someone who could speak on this topic. So from my worldview, I feel like God had a hand in that, and I'm really grateful for it. And thank you all so much for showing up and for listening. David, thank you for posting ways in which you can follow Lucas and his work and purchase any of his work and his writings, his book. So check that out here in the chat. Thank you all again. Lucas, thank you so much.
Thank you, Erin. This has been an absolute treat. It's been great.
Thank you. Wonderful. Take care. Be well, all of you. We will be pausing our taboo topics for a couple of months, but we will pick it back up again in the fall. So stay tuned for more. And thank you all for being here. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.